So I started doing the work to try to teach people that looked like me and thought like me in the evangelical world to possibly see a different way of thinking. So here I am, some 15 years later, and love the work that I do. So here we're going to start our presentation. And first, I want to thank Mike, who's doing the tech on this, to have figured out how I can share a stage with Ed, who is 500 miles from me, and Trey, who is 2,300 miles from me. So I really appreciate this technology, and hopefully I'll actually use it well. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the goals for the session today. So our focus passage is 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. And the reason this is the focus passage is this is the first place in the Bible that the word homosexual appears in any language. It happens to have appeared in English. It's in the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which the New Testament came out in 1946. And so this is the verse we're going to focus on. We're going to look at what it meant in context and time, and then we're going to trace it through time to try to understand why the translation team that worked on the RSV Bible translated some Greek words in this passage as the words homosexual. And just so that you know where I stand on my theology, I just learned how to express this in a wonderful class by Karen Keene, who's also one of our gifted speakers this weekend. I hold an accommodation and adoption view of the Bible, which means I believe that God stoops down to us and gives us revelation, and that is ongoing in our lives. And God has adopted human authors to transmit his messages to us. So another point that I want to say is that we're tracing this historical work through the Western world. And I'm very well aware that same-sex relationships and two-spirit people and homosexuality has existed in other cultures. But why we are tracing it through the Western world is because we in the Western world are the ones that made the translation error and exported it to the rest of the world. So the way we're going to first start is we're going to talk about how the Bible was constructed, and Ed is going to do that for us.
Okay, so first what we want to talk about is the big question that we should be asking ourselves right now is, how do we view our Bible? So how do we view our Bible? How do we look at our Bible? And, wait a minute, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves right now, because before we ask how we view our Bible, we might be jumping ahead of ourselves. We need to ask how we got the Bible in the first place. And the reason I like to ask these two questions and dive into them before we have this discussion is because as I've been talking with pastors and church leaders over the past several years, I've realized one of the reasons that they're not able to kind of move on in understanding this is they might have kind of a false narrative, a misunderstanding of how we got our Bible and how we view our Bible. And so let's talk about that for a little bit. So how did the Bible come to be? How did the Bible come to be? First of all, it started with an unorganized, oh, sorry about that. We got mixed up on here. Okay. So it started from many scrolls to one book. And so it was an unorganized collection of scrolls written by godly people in ancient times. And there were many more books written than those which actually made it into the Bible. And also, the Bible was written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, over a period of 1,300 years. It is comprised of 66 books inspired by a divine and holy God, but it utilized about 40 human authors. So we could say that the Bible is a group project. It's a collaboration of a divine and holy God and imperfect humans. It wasn't until the 4th century that the church leaders decided which of the many books would make the cut. And even then, there remained disagreements for centuries after that. This is a picture of a Greek Bible called Codex Vaticanus, and Vaticanus because it's held at the Vatican Library, and you can see the date there. It dates back to 300 AD. So previous to this, we had scrolls, and then the technology came where they started to cut the scrolls up and create what we know as our modern day book with pages that we can flip through and bind together. So this is the oldest known Bible that we have, and in Greek, 300 AD, and it's completely in capital letters with no periods, commas, or any other type of punctuation. And as you can see, it's 3 columns there. You can see it if you want to, page by page, through the. There are several archives that hold it online where there are pictures of each page that have been preserved. So you can even see little marks here and there, stamps on there, different types of parts where the pages are starting to fall apart and so forth. But what happened was, by the 5th century, parts of the New Testament had been translated into over 400 languages. But in that same century, the church leaders decided to reduce it to one language, which became the Latin Vulgate. So for the next 1,000 years, the only Bibles we had were in Latin. We didn't even have chapter breaks until the 13th century, and we didn't even have verse breaks until the 16th century. But about this time in the 16th century, for those of you who consider yourselves students of history, you know that we had the Great Reformation come around this time. And we started to see Bibles in multiple languages and available to bigger portions of the population. So now we can ask the question, how do we view our Bible? How do we look at our Bible? And there are many different views represented by many different Christians over the past 2,000 years. One of the tools we use to evaluate our view of the Bible is the doctrine of inerrancy. Interestingly enough, the Chicago Doctrine of Inerrancy did not exist until 1978. So for a couple of hundred years, we were kind of dealing with this question, is the Bible perfect in every word, in every idea? How do we view this? Because it's a collaboration of a divine God who is perfect and humans who are imperfect. So how do we view this? And it wasn't really a big deal for most of the past 2,000 years. But obviously, it became a big deal in the past century, and that's why evangelical leaders got together and decided to create the doctrine of inerrancy in 1978 in Chicago. So let's look at that just a little bit. Let's talk about this doctrine of inerrancy. So if you look at the screen right now, you can see I have it divided into 3 sections. On the far left, and this is a very brief summary of the doctrine of inerrancy. You can see it online if you want to look at it in detail. But in summary, the doctrine of inerrancy states that God-inspired scripture is dictated to man. So man would write these, what we call original autographs, which have been lost to time. And from there, in the middle category here, scribes copy the scripture and it gets distributed. So over the past couple of thousand years, we didn't have copy machines, obviously. And so people who were called scribes, that was their full-time job, was just to copy these manuscripts, and then they could get them out to more churches, more people, more Christian communities. And then today, in the third column on the right, we can see that scripture is translated and circulated around the world. So the doctrine of inerrancy kind of states these types of things, and it also allows for the fact that scribes can make mistakes in their copying, and we can go back and look at those and analyze those. Books, hordes of books have been written about this particular topic. But there becomes a problem when what I see in today's evangelical world kind of looks like this. This God-inspired scripture is dictated to man, and that's what I have in my Bible sitting in my dresser. So this becomes problematic when people leave out all the activity that took place from these 2 points in the last 2,000 years. So it's kind of like playing a 2,000-year game of telephone and being convinced that what we have heard at the end of the 2,000 years is exactly what was intended by the one who initiated it 2,000 years ago. Remember, the Bible is a collaboration of divine and human. So by understanding how the Bible was written and knowing that we need to read it in a proper historical context, we're able to more clearly understand God's message to us. Without this, we could be guilty of an anachronistic reading. Let's talk about that word for a minute. Anachronism. The word comes from the Greek, meaning against time. Anna meaning against, chronism is time. This is when we take a modern day understanding of a concept and we plug it into an ancient document and expect to understand that culture based upon our modern concept. Such sloppiness can give us warped understanding of an ancient text. Now, Kathy is going to highlight some of the elements about the ancient worldview that can assist us in understanding the text accurately.
Yeah, it's really interesting when people think that what the people in the ancient worlds or even the first century would have thought what we think about topics like sex and gender. So the first thing we have to do is we have to put ourselves in the context of the first century and even before that, when the Old Testament's books were written too. So I want to talk about the context that ancient peoples lived in. They lived in an agrarian society, meaning their existence centered on maintaining and producing crops and farms. And we need to take a couple of minutes, the next few minutes, and understand how they may have viewed male and female, their bodies, and sex, so that we can read scripture in context, in the context in which they were written. If we foolishly even imagine that Paul, when he was writing the book of First Corinthians, could have imagined what we know about males and females and our bodies and sex today, we are very likely to abuse his words, which we know many Christians have done. And so this is the basis of our problem. Oops. Next. So we're looking at, I think I've got the wrong slide here. One sec. See, this is where Mike did great and I did not. But I want to talk about, I skipped this on the first one. The basis of this entire talk today is we're going to be looking at two Greek words, which for 1900 years after they were penned by Paul, they meant they were interpreted as sinful behaviors. Sometimes that sinful behavior changed in the context of a time period, but for the most time in that period, they were understood as sinful behaviors that any man, because we really only are focused on men, any man was capable of doing. And then it's only in the last 75 years, and this is the problem, that those two words were combined and they came to mean the word homosexual, which includes women. So this is the basis of our problem. So we are now looking in the context of an agrarian worldview of the Bible, and we're going to talk about specific foundational beliefs as they relate to sex and family in the Bible. First thing we're going to look at procreation, purity and pollution, patriarchy, and patrilineage. Procreation, how babies are made. Just as a farmer places a seed in the ground and hopes that it will grow, this was the view of a man's semen. So he would place the semen in a woman who was just a planting field. She had no contribution. We wouldn't know that though a woman contributed to a baby by producing an egg until the late 1800s. So it was essentially the man that placed the seed in the woman, and the whole of a human was in his semen. So it was like a little human was going and being planted in the womb, and it would grow into a full human. This was their view of procreation. Next, we look at purity and pollution, things that are sacred and clean, things that are profane and unclean. We know this applies to people, food, animals, but it also applies to body fluids. Body fluids that are inside the body are clean, but when they move outside the body, they're unclean. So when one is having sex or one is in an action with another person, they are not to touch any of those body fluids. So especially menstrual blood and semen and fecal materials, those are unclean. The next topic is patriarchy. Patriarchal societies elevate men over women, physically, intellectually, sexually, and biologically. Actually, I'm drinking out of my favorite season is the fall of the patriarchy cup this year. Thank you, Alicia Johnston. So patriarchy, by the time the New Testament was written, patriarchy had already been in place for about 8,000 years. It was pretty entrenched. When tribes of people began to settle in areas, they divided their tasks. The women gathered and cared for the children, and the men hunted. The better the hunter a man was, the more meat he had that he could serve beyond his family, and he bartered to other people in the tribe, and this gave him power and power within the tribe. And it's always been, a saying that he who brings home the bacon rules the roost, and he who had the extra meat gained the power. Thus, 12,000 years ago, began the dominance of men over women in every facet of life. And finally, we have on the last thing on our list here is patrilineage. The descendants are traced through the father's line. So a man must place his seed in a line where his property and his inheritance are protected. Yeah, there we go. So this is actually a funny section to me. I've often shared these views of bodies with friends when they're hiking with me, and they say, like, people couldn't have believed this. This is why it's important to understand how bodies and males and females were perceived in the ancient world. Because it's honestly so ridiculous how they viewed bodies. I want you to keep in mind that the views that I'm going to tell you about are from the 5th century BC until about the 15th century. It's a very long time. The ancients thought our bodies were comprised of 4 humors or liquids in the body. There was green and black bile, phlegm, and blood. And these liquids and the balance of these liquids not only made up your temperament, but the balance or imbalance of these liquids also determined if you were masculine or feminine. And the superior liquids, the good liquids, are the hot and dry ones, blood and yellow bile. And the men had those, of course. And the inferior liquids were cold and wet, and that was phlegm and green bile. So the balance of those in the body, again, determined if you were masculine or feminine. Of course, the men had the good hot and dry liquids, and because their bodies were hot, their stuff had to hang on the outside. And because the women were cold, their stuff gets tucked up on the inside. And because he was hot, his blood could be pushed up through his body. His body had the heat to push his blood up and make his shoulders nice and strong and broad, and push the blood to his head, so into his brain, that made him smart. And the women just did not have the heat of the body to do that. So the blood could not push up and give them strength in the shoulders. It just sat in their hips and made their hips wide. And because it couldn't push the blood to their brains, they were intellectually inferior to men too. Also, the female body was thought to be the inverse of the male body. So everything he had, and the female body is seen through his lens. He is the standard. The female body is all the male parts, but the inverse and on the inside. So until about the 1600s, although there were slang words for a vagina, there was no scientific word for a vagina. It was just called a female penis. It was just the opposite on the inside and shaped to hold the penis. So to be masculine and male was to have the admirable traits. And Ed will review these again later too, like courage and virility and self-control and intellect. But to be a woman, conversely, was to have these traits. And this will be very important when we look at Greek words that we're focused on today. A woman was morally weak. She was given to unnatural vices. She was lazy and unchaste and lustful and whorish and impure. And of course, she took the submissive role in sex. Sex was about power and domination. Sex was not something you did with somebody. It was something that you did to somebody. A real man didn't take the passive or penetrated role that a female did, because then he would have been giving the control over of his body to somebody else. Sex between males of the same age was not common. Sex between men and boys was very common. So typical of that culture in the first century where Paul was writing, men had prostitutes for pleasure. They had mistresses for daily servicing, and they had wives to create legitimate heirs. This was their life. This was their culture. So the ancient view of patriarchy, the views about sex and procreation, the superior role of men, and the inferior role of women are inextricably linked to the writing and understanding of these New Testament scriptures that we're looking at. You have to understand that this is their worldview that they saw sex and family through. If you miss this, you're going to miss the original meaning of these verses. One last thing I want to touch on before moving on to Ed. There's sometimes people will say procreation was important in the first century. That's not necessarily true. Celibacy, or the life of the ascetics, was of higher value than those who were married from the first to about the fourth century, because people really believed the second coming of Jesus was imminent. It was coming quite soon. And so sex, even any kind of sex, was at lower value in a marriage than being a celibate. Well, by the third and fourth century, when the church fathers realized Jesus isn't coming back real soon and we need to grow this religion, so we need to start making babies, then all of a sudden Plan B came along. Augustine was one of the ones that introduced this. He said, it's not sex that's the real problem, which it had been. It is sex with desire that's the real problem. So any sex that is had with passion or lust, even in a marriage, is a problem. And so that started to change. So now the idea, the teaching coming from the church fathers was any non-procreative sex was sinful. And I've always found that there's a Catholic theologian who said it's just very odd that this fourth century church father and his ideas, Augustine's quite an interesting person to study, that his ideas about sex have projected so far into the future, another 14 or 1500 years. This Catholic theologian actually calls this the long shadow of Augustine's penis. It's a very long shadow that he has cast. So generally, what is going to this is going to be generally true till almost the beginning of the 1900s. That's a pretty surprising thing. Good sex, appropriate sex, is male dominant. The man sexually penetrates and is on top. Passion and desires were controlled. Good sex was procreative or has the potential to create babies. Bad sex, again, through the beginning of the 1900s, was a male was not dominant. He was being penetrated, or a woman was on top. Passions and desires are not controlled, or they're lustful, and it's non-procreative sex. So now we're going to go back to Ed, and he's going to talk about these Greek words that have become so problematic in the translations.
Kathy and I typically do an 8-hour seminar, which could really be 15 hours. And we go over a much wider variety. And we actually focus on, when we look at the Bible, we look at 6 passages. But for sake of time, we're mostly keying in on one passage today, and that's 1 Corinthians 6:9. And if we look at this particular passage, let's read through here. And what I've done is I've replaced the words that have been so translated in many different ways over the past 2,000 years, and I've left the original Greek. 1 Corinthians 6:9, or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor malakoi, nor arsenokoitai. So it gives a list of bad people in this verse that will not get into heaven. And I've used the original Greek words here just so we can focus on those Greek words for the time period while we learn what those Greek words mean. So we have seen a huge variety of words for these Greek words as translations in the past 2,000 years. So in order to understand the meaning of a word, it's important to connect that meaning with the understanding that the author had who put that word in the sentence. Words change over time, meanings change over time, vocabulary changes over time, culture changes over time, and our understanding of various concepts change over time. Dictionaries did not exist until the 1480s. Otherwise, we could just pull up a first century dictionary and determine what Paul intended by malakoi and arsenokoitai, and the case would be solved. Therefore, it's imperative that we seek ancient usages of these two words. And the only option, since we don't have any first century dictionaries, would be to see how these words were positioned within sentences as close to the time of Paul as possible. So malakoi was used in many, many ancient texts. Simply put, it means soft, and in fact describes a soft clothing in Matthew 11:8. But this usage does not entail any kind of moral character. And our focal verse, 1 Corinthians 6:9, definitely is discussing a moral issue. So here are a couple of examples where malakoi is actually used in ancient times. If we look at 200 BC, there was a famous playwright named Plautus, Plautus, and he used the word malakoi in one of his plays to describe a man who seduces other men's wives. A man who seduces other men's wives. Doesn't sound very gay, huh? Absolutely, because it did not have anything to do with same-sex activity, of only same-sex activity, because in some cases it might just be a wild man that's actually being portrayed. First century Jewish historian Josephus lived at the time of Jesus and used the word malakoi to describe a person who is weak in battle and enjoys luxury. So sounds kind of like a lazy person who doesn't want to fight, who doesn't want to care for the country and protect the country, and just is self-indulgent, only worrying about their own luxury. So what I want to do now is look at some other, for the sake of time, we can't really look at other usages of malakoi, but what I want to do is look at a working definition that we can use. And I've created this to kind of consolidate a lot of the historical pieces that I've studied. And if we had a first century dictionary on the word malakoi, it would probably look like this. So let's read through this. Weakness of character. Someone soft, meaning lazy, decadent, lack of courage, cannot put up with hard work. Coward. One who drinks too much, has too much sex, straight or gay. One who loves gourmet food. Men who pretty themselves up to further their sexual exploits, whether it be straight or gay. So it was just as much heterosexual as it was homosexual in ancient times. The other word in this verse is arsenokoitai. So this word has not yet been found in any other ancient documents prior to 1 Corinthians. And I say not yet because archaeologists are still finding information, and we may find something that gives us more insight. In the meantime, we have to work with what God has provided with us. And one of the things that we have are some other ancient documents that kind of give us an idea of what Paul meant by this term. The closest surviving text to the time of the Apostle Paul that contains the word arsenokoitai is the Sibylline Oracles from the 2nd century, just decades after 1 Corinthians was written. And in it, we see two distinct sin lists. One is an economic sin list, and the other one is a sexual sin list. Interestingly enough, arsenokoitai appears on the economic sin list, but it does not appear on the sexual sin list. If it were a sexual sin, then we would definitely expect it in the sexual sin list, but we don't. It's not there. We also have another ancient document called the Acts of John that appeared in the 2nd century, also a few decades after the time that the Apostle Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. And it also contains an economic sin list. It gives a condemnation of the rich men of Ephesus, and arsenokoitai is on that list. The emphasis on that list is power, money, unjust exploitation. So again, we see arsenokoitai grouped together with sins of economic exploitation. So I put together a working definition for the word arsenokoitai, and for sake of time, I can't go through the other usages in history, but to kind of show you, if we did have a first century dictionary to explain arsenokoitai, this is probably what we would see. An economic exploitation by means of sex, abuse of power by means of sex, using sex for social or economic gain, unjust or coercive use of another person sexually, exploitative sex aimed at gaining social power, or a married man taking a male to bed, which is adultery. So, one of the things that we see in history, and when we look at this particular word and how it was used here, if we were going to look at it in our modern way of thinking, sometimes I like to say a two-way casting couch might kind of explain this term a little bit more. So you have a person using their body to get casted maybe in something, and you have a person using their power to choose someone for that particular acting position, using their power to gain sex. So we see this kind of exchange here. So both ways can be an abuse of power, can be kind of a modern use of arsenokoitai. So in the ancient world, obviously we have pederasty, which kind of did the same thing. People were using that in order to use their position and their power to exploit a younger boy. So right now we are going to go back to Kathy, and she's going to talk about our views of sex and procreation and how they shifted over the centuries after the New Testament was written.
Thanks. We're just going to keep moving through history. We're going to look at verses, we're going to look at cultures, we're going to look at science. So the next big step is after the Middle Ages, after those views about sex and male and female and procreation and family started shifting, they started shifting in about the 17th century, about 1650. So our next period of time we're going to be focused on is 1650 to 1850. Worldview is going to change because it's not going to be patriarchy. Well, it's going to still be patriarchy, but the view of procreation and male and female roles are going to shift. So the worldview is going to shift. So we can expect then how we see certain verses in the Bible to also shift. The biggest change that's going to happen is the world is going to be centered, or views are going to be centered on science rather than religion. So there'll be this shift of the authority from religion to science. Science and medicine are elevated and religious beliefs are challenged, whereas people had believed that earthquakes and pandemics and floods were because people sinned. We're going to find some scientific reasons for those things. And also, we're going to find some different views of the body. Science is going to show us different views of the body. It is during this period of time, in this several hundred year period, that we're also going to realize that women are contributing to the procreation of a child. We're also going to then name the vagina scientifically. And also, shockingly, it wasn't until the 1800s that they even realized that the skeleton of a woman was different. Before that, everything was the human skeleton. So now the lines are no longer that male and female is because this imbalance of these humors in the body, the biles, the blood, and the phlegm, is because they are constructed differently. They're anatomically different. So now these anatomical differences are going to start to create more distinct lines between what is male and female, where those lines kind of blurred before because of the balance of these biles. Now those lines are going to be more distinct. There's also an increase of personal freedom and expression. And these come as a result in Europe of the Age of Enlightenment and also the French Revolution. The French Revolution greatly changed the culture in Europe, and it spread throughout Europe. So personal expressions of lots of things, including sex, was more free. People weren't under the heavier hand of religion and the monarchy and the state. People were able to express themselves a little bit more. And also, importantly, the sodomy laws started to change in Europe. The French, after the French Revolution, got rid of their anti-sodomy laws, and that traveled through the rest of the continent, not to England, but to the Netherlands and Belgium and France and Italy. And that started expanding, and that's going to also become very important in our story. Industrialization begins in the late 1700s. It moves people away from the watchful eyes of their families, and it puts them in new positions in cities where they're able to express more of this personal freedom, and they've got money in their pockets. So relationships change. People are able to maybe investigate things sexually that they had never investigated before. Cities are big, you can get lost in them. There's also an increase in literacy. And there's also an increase in the production of pamphlets and books and periodicals. So people are reading, and they're becoming more aware of other ideas. Ideas are exchanging. You're not told what to think anymore. People are starting to think a little bit differently. So lots of changes are happening in this period between 1650 and 1850. And I actually found this period so fascinating. And if I were to label it, I would also call it the gender revolution. People say, oh, that's just happened in the last 5 years when trans people wanted to use toilets. No, the gender revolution happened several hundred years ago. So there's this greater awareness of what is male and female, and people are more in tune with it. With cities come people communicating or communing together. And we find in England places where men are gathering and they are having sex or dressing effeminately, and they're called molly houses. This is the very end of the 1600s. There's also such communities in Berlin and Paris and in the Netherlands. And what the difference is here is before you could not have, or people wouldn't have been thinking so strongly about the difference between male and female anatomically, and the lines have got to be very distinct. Now, when they see these men that are a little bit more effeminate, it comes more on their radar. They are more noticeable. Let me go to a slide. So this is the biggest shift that's going to happen in this time period. The authority over sexuality moves from the priests and religion, where religion had blamed and shamed. Science now starts to observe and name. This is unbelievably important. So this is a big shift. Now, I want to say one other thing about another topic, masturbation. And this is an important topic because at some point, the word that we see now as homosexual in the Bible, it is the people that are getting sent to hell are going to be masturbators. The culture seems to always look at what's the worst thing I can see in my culture. I'm going to plop that in there. And masturbators will be one of those people. So where did this idea that masturbation was this horrible sin that you should go to hell for? Some bright spark in 1714 wrote a pamphlet, an anonymous pamphlet, taking this thing that so many people had done and making this abominable, deviant action. Nobody had even talked about it. These ancient fathers from the 4th century BC to Galen, who was one of the most famous physicians in the ancient world, they only mentioned masturbation in passing like 2 to 4 times in all of their writings. But someone comes along and says, masturbation is a problem. You can find this article online. I should have linked it because it's actually very amusing to read. And this article says, if a person masturbates, whether they be male or female, it is going to break down their body, it is going to destroy their brain, and eventually it's going to lead to death. So it has pictures of people that masturbate, and they've got sweat dripping off of them, and they are crippled, and they've got warts all over their face. But not to worry, the guy that sells this pamphlet is also selling the cure. So it was a way of selling snake oil. But unfortunately, that idea gets entrenched in the culture. It gets taken from country to country to country, rewritten, plagiarized. People come up with new solutions not to masturbate. And then it becomes this idea that masturbation is the cause of all the worst things you can imagine. And eventually it's going to be the cause of homosexuality, but it's the cause of epilepsy. It's the cause of, going insane. It is the cause of everything. So masturbation, the problem of masturbation is really important to notice here. So now we've set the stage, but also during this period, women had been the temptresses of old. Women were the out of control ones. Women were the lusty ones. Women were the ones that they just couldn't control their own sexual appetites. During this period, though, it flips. Men are the ones who are out of control, and women take on this new, pure role of motherhood. So now these sexual roles are also flipping too. Now, this sets the stage for a beginning of understanding of sexuality. Things have to be in place for people to ask the next question. And we are now set, the stage is now set to ask the next question. Why are there people that seem to be attracted to a non-procreative sex acts, either exclusively or they're doing this? Why are there people that are participating in sex for pleasure and they're not doing it to have a baby? This was an innovative question at the time. And so we're going to center ourselves in the Confederation of German States now. And this is there's an interesting book that was only published about 5 years ago, and it's the translation of a book that was written in Latin in 1844 by a guy named Heinrich Kahn. And until this book was translated from Latin to English, it was the first time it was ever translated in any language, nobody knew that there was like this missing link between these views about masturbation to views about sexuality. So what Heinrich Kahn writes in this book, he's the first scientist, the first doctor who comes along and says, I am going to observe and name. Big difference here. I'm not going to blame and shame. I'm going to observe and name. So he looks and he says, people are having non-procreative sex. These are sexual deviancies. These are sexual perversions. And I'm going to classify them. And I'm going to try to figure out why people are doing it. So he classifies it into 5 groups of deviant sexual behavior. Obviously, masturbation is going to make it on that list. It had been a problem for 150 years at that point. Lesbianism, but it's not the same meaning that we have. Lesbianism at the time meant rubbing genitals on the thigh of another person. Didn't matter who the 2 participants were, male, female, female, female. It just didn't matter. The next one, obviously, is bestiality. That's not procreative sex. The next one is sodomy. Sodomy is any non-procreative sex. Body parts in different orifices, not necessarily male-male. That's going to switch in the 1920s. And then, oddly, and no explanation on his list, his other 5th big concern about sexual perversion is sex with statues. Don't know why that is. So he tries to figure out why people are sexually deviant, comes up with a couple of ideas. Maybe they masturbate too much. That would be the top idea. Or maybe as babies, they were wrapped too tightly in warm clothing and slept on warm beds. Or maybe they were given chocolate. Or maybe they were coddled too much. All of these things led to masturbation. And of course, masturbation leads to all kinds of problems. Next person that comes along is Karl Ulrichs in 1860. And I said this all centers around the Confederate German states. Heinrich Kahn was in Vienna. So he questions, people are questioning now, right? They're starting to question. He says, I am sexually attracted to people, to my own sex. I don't know why I am. There's no word for me. So he invents this word, earnings, Urning, and he says, I am one of these people, don't know why I am one of these people. Oh, one point I want to say about Heinrich Kahn. Heinrich Kahn believed that same-sex behavior was a one-of time. Like people didn't have a sexual orientation. They just, because of excesses or because of these things or because of masturbation, they were attracted to the same-sex behavior, but it wasn't an orientation. Now, Heinrich Kahn, Karl Ulrich's going to come along and says, 50 years later, not even 50 years, 20 years later, he says, yeah, but I seem to be attracted to the same sex like exclusively. He calls himself an Urning, and under a pseudonym, he produces 3 pamphlets, and then this information gets out. Germany had really lax censorship laws. The rest of Europe did not. France and Germany and England, forget England, they all had really high censorship laws. So the only place these pamphlets even could have been printed and circulated was Germany. And a few years after that, Germany was trying to figure out, as they became a unified Germany with very conservative Prussia up here and very progressive Bavaria down here, which allowed for sodomy, and Prussia that did not. As this country was coming together, how are we going to come up with a legal system that deals with all kinds of things, including sodomy? So the debates start in Germany, open debates in the parliament. So Karl Urich, instead of hiding in the background, goes and testifies before the parliament, before 500 lawyers at first, to try to change the laws. He's known as the first activist in the world, Karl Urich. So he tries to change the laws. There's such fascinating stories around this time, and they're in the book. They're really good stories. But what happens is Germany decides not to allow for sodomy. But during this period of time, there's still this exchange. As the 20 years are going on and they're trying to figure out the legal system, there's an exchange of ideas, which is wonderful. And so people are reading about themselves. Other people are writing pamphlets and periodicals. They're sneaking out of Germany and getting into other countries. When one such pamphlet got into England, the publisher was fined a huge fine and put in prison for 6 months for even selling this requested pamphlet. There's just no way to express how the rest of Europe was shut down, but Germany was not. Germany was exchanging these ideas. So scientists were moving forward and discussing, how come people seem to be same-sex attracted? Is it because there's a female brain in their head? Is it because they masturbate too much? Is it because their body parts are deformed? Just going to say it. Maybe their penis is designed specifically to go into an anus, and maybe their anus is designed differently. They were actually looking at body parts to see, well, maybe it's body parts that make them this way. Or maybe it's something in their brain. So there's this huge progression of what is it that causes people to be same-sex attracted. And then in the 1900s, early 1900s, Freud comes along. And Freud says, he has a kind of a different slant on sex in general. He says sex is not just about procreation. This is a huge step because all through time, the main intent of sex had been procreation. But now he says, no, sex is pleasure. Pleasure, it's intimacy and it's pleasure. So he starts talking about the elevated importance of intimacy and de-elevates the importance of procreation. So he calls this libido. And so he, very interestingly, just 20 years before that, the word heterosexual meant someone that had a morbid, which means an obsessive attraction to the opposite sex, wanted too much sex, and didn't necessarily want to procreate. So the word heterosexual had this really bad connotation. And the word homosexual meant they had a morbid attraction to the same sex and didn't want to procreate. But now Freud comes along and he says, no, enjoying sex is okay. So you're going to have this slow, well, it's not that slow. It takes about 10, 15 years. Heterosexuality is going to become normalized. So sex without the need for procreation. And homosexuality, always got to have an opposite, it becomes the abnormal. So this is the point at which we're at. So heterosexual in the 1920s, it had been defined as something wrong, medically wrong. But by 1934, it's going to be defined as normal sexuality. Okay, so now the next step I'm going to come back in is we're going to get to the 1930s and we're going to sit in the room with a translation team. But before that, Ed needs to talk more about the Bible.
Thank you, Kathy. So now that we've have looked at the first and second century usages of malakoi and arsenokoitai, and we have heard from Kathy how people perceived sex over the past couple thousand years, let's look at how Bibles translated these terms over the centuries. So if we look at some of the Bible translations over the past few hundred years, the first one we're going to look at for 1 Corinthians 6:9, and I'm just talking about malakoi and arsenokoitai in this verse. In 1378, this is when Professor John Wycliffe translated the Bible. And remember, the printing press didn't come out until 1455. So this was a handwritten Bible and New Testament only. And so he didn't make very many copies since it took a long time to write out the entire New Testament and do the translation. For malakoi, he used the term lecherous. And I've left the spellings in here so that you can see how these are spelled in the original documents. And spelling kind of wasn't the same as it is today. It just didn't count, and you would see different people spell things differently. So I want to keep as authentic as I can to the original documents that we're looking at. But in this 1378 Bible translation of 1 Corinthians 6:9, malakoi was lecherous, and arsenokoitai was lechery with men. Now we have to look at kind of the meaning of the word lechery and lecherous back in that particular day. And I have dictionaries that span hundreds of years. My oldest dictionary is from the 1500s. But I have access to other dictionaries and other ancient documents, commentaries, Bibles, because I'm a research scholar at the Huntington Library here locally in Southern California. So I can tell you from the study of looking at how they define words in these days, what John Wycliffe was thinking for the term lechery, it carried the connotation of a person who extends unwanted sexual advances on someone. So there's that abusive nature, which also appears in the King James Version, by the way. The next one in 1534, weakling. So they translated malakoi as weakling and arsenokoitai as boy molesters. And this was the German version in 1534, the very first time the Bible was translated for the masses in German, in the German language. And this was done by Martin Luther during the Great Reformation. So something interesting to note here is throughout the centuries, whenever the German Bible was updated, they continued to keep this German term Knabenschänder for boy molesters in every single updated version, with the exception of about the 1950s. They changed it to something a little different, and it basically was kind of similar, but boy molesters was the term they came back to right after that. They did not change this in German to the word homosexual until 1983, when an American company known as Biblica, which puts out the New International Version, paid for and helped to do a new German translation that came out in 1983. And so we had the American influence of putting the word homosexual into the German Bible the first time in history in 1983, when the Germans are the ones, as Kathy pointed out, who understood and created the term homosexual from all of their studies on human sexuality. The next version we see here is in 1535, weaklings and abusers of themselves with mankind. 1557, wantons and abusers of themselves with mankind. 1560, watan, and you can see they spelled wanton differently just 3 years later, and bougueres. And so we could talk about the definitions of bougere and the Bouguerie laws and so forth. We're not going to talk about that today, but it's really an interesting piece of history. Let's go to the next slide here and continue. In 1611, this is the King James Version. The King James Version for Malakoi put effeminate, and for arsenokoitai, abusers of themselves with mankind. So we have to look at the definition of effeminate at the time. And the definition of an effeminate at the time basically meant lazy, slothful, things that they would attribute to women. And if you think about it, even in today's terms, if we see kids playing on a playground and there's a boy who is swinging the bat to play baseball, and some of the other guys are making fun of him, and they might say, "You swing like a girl." Well, that's considered an insult. And throughout history, we used this effeminate attachment as an insult, as a way to kind of say weakness or someone who isn't as good as the others, who isn't as manly. And so, but that's the word that they use, which actually came from the Latin effeminate, which was in the Latin Vulgate for 1,000 years. But we have to look at the meaning of that term at the time it was originally used. Today, I see people use the King James Version to point out a feminine guy and say, "You are going to hell because you act feminine." And that's a complete abuse of the Bible, a complete misunderstanding of the meanings of these words. And it's horrible and it needs to stop. And that's why we work so hard. 1901, this brings us up to 1901, effeminate and abusers of themselves with men. This is the ASV, the American Standard Version, which was the precursor to the RSV, the Revised Standard Version. And that's what the big Bible that we know that actually introduced the word homosexual. So commentaries have changed meanings of these verses over time. They've explained them differently over time, over the centuries. And we really have to look at the original usage. It's so incredibly important. So right now we're going to take a break. And after we come back from the break, Kathy's going to educate us on how the culture changed during this period.
I think I'll just take the stage, Ed. You go away.
I think it sounds like a plan.
Okay. The beauty about writing a book is that you get to tell lots of stories, or those 8-hour presentations, you get to tell lots of stories because I'm a storyteller. And I could fire hose you with history, and Ed could fire hose you with facts. But when you slow down and you tell a story, everything starts to gel and solidify in your head. And I'm going to try to just take a couple of snippets of time here and tell some stories which are really interesting. And the reason I'm telling them is because these are the periods where things are going to change. I care about when definitions of words change, when the culture does something, or someone in the culture or a group in the culture does something significant to change the conversation around homosexuality. And it happens quite a bit. And the disheartening thing for me in doing this work is sometimes a person or a small group of people got it really wrong and the damage lingered for decades. And then somebody got it really right and it didn't catch on. So those things are frustrating, but you're going to hear just a couple of those stories today. But I'm hoping that in the end, possibly Ed and I getting it right will catch on. The incident that I want to talk about is going to change the definition, the legal definition of sodomy within the culture and within the military in the United States. And again, we're focused on the United States and the Western world because we are the ones that made the mistake. So one incident happened during the last pandemic, the 1918 pandemic. Before this, the term sodomy was used to mean any non-procreative sex act, and it had been consistent for 800 years to mean this. But now the definition, and a person that was that did those acts was called a sodomite. This becomes important too. A sodomite did not mean a homosexual. A sodomite meant a person that participated in these sex acts. But now a sodomite, that definition is going to change to a homosexual. In the military, consensual oral sex was not against military law. This had been consistent since the Confederate Army. And what was against the military law was rape, was a vice, and that had been persecuted. So consensual sex, oral sex, was not against military law, and there was no law in the state of Rhode Island also against consensual oral sex. It's going to change. So the new Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, he not only banned use of alcohol on the Navy bases and the Navy shipyards, can you imagine? He also banned any woman that was even thought to be a prostitute within 5 miles of a Navy base. They would ship them off to prison. At this time, about 30,000 women were imprisoned in the United States. Clearly, with the women out, they thought they had solved all their sexual deviancy problems. But this is the time, starting in about the 1890s in the United States, there was the beginning of a subculture of gay people. Homosexuals, gay people, wouldn't have called them gay, homosexuals in various cities. And they had a different language that they used and a different way of dressing and interacting and customs. So gay culture was already starting about by the 1880s, 1890s. And they were also, as I said, dressing differently and hanging out in places where they could be found. So now I have a dog that is, hold on one second. If I didn't stop her from crying, she would be crying the whole time. So during this time, men were having sex with men. And this is the short version of this story. And it's the story you've never heard that is so interesting. There was a guy in this hospital in Newport, Rhode Island, which was at the time a very small Navy base until the First World War exploded it. And people were coming back from Europe, convalescing there after the pandemic. And there was a guy there that happened to notice. He had been a detective in Connecticut beforehand, and his specialty was that he obsessed about men doing perverted behaviors, and he liked to capture them and put them in prison. Well, he happened to overhear conversations while he was in the hospital about men in town who were having sex with men. And he decided he was going to do something about this. So he went to the head of his base and he said, I've got a plan to entrap these people that are doing perverted sexual behaviors. And then the head of his base went and got approval from the Undersecretary of the Navy at the time. And they recruited 12 young sailors that looked particularly young to go into town and to entrap the locals and to entrap people in the Navy. And then they did a big raid on them and they put some sailors in a prison in an old ship, but what could they charge them with? They couldn't charge them with anything because it wasn't against the law in the Navy and it wasn't against the law in the state of Rhode Island. Well, this exploded. It ended up in the newspaper, but it also ended up for 18 months at a Senate hearing. And at the end of the Senate hearing, the senators were so disgusted that young sailors had been used as decoys to entrap other sailors and the locals that the senators threw this out. They were absolutely disgusted. And of the person that approved of this, so the Navy at the time was very aware that, oops, we screwed up. We put these people in prison and there was no law against it. So without any discussion, they went in there and they changed this. It's called Article 93, and to change the military discussion of sodomy. And they changed the definition of sodomy to now include, and most exclusively, consensual oral sex between people, between men. So now the definition of sodomy has changed. And when it changed in the military, it started to change in the legal system, and it started to change in the culture. So all of a sudden, sodomites were identified as homosexual men. Big change. And there was no discussion about it. So the senators were so mad that this had happened, and with the approval of the Undersecretary of the Navy, they told this Undersecretary of the Navy, who had run on the 1920 failed presidential ticket as the vice presidential candidate, who had then gone back to private practice as a lawyer. They told him as he left the Senate hearing, what you did is so despicable that we advise that you never run for a public office again. Who was that Undersecretary of the Navy? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected to 4 terms as president. He's the one that approved this atrocious act in the Navy in 1918 and 19 that changed the definition of sodomy. So I just find this interesting that sometimes it's one person making a silly mistake. So now, but I'm trying to get us, so that's the 1920. I'm trying to get us to 1930. What's also happening in the culture in the 1920s and the early 30s is it's called the sex crime panics. So all over the country, there are these crimes against young boys, against children, but we also have the problem of yellow journalism at the time. Everything was sensationalized to sell newspapers. So a man may have kidnapped a child, no sexual assault on the child. The man could have been heterosexual, mostly was heterosexual. But when it came out in the newspaper, the writing was so salacious and so sexual that this sex crime panic just infused the country. There are books written about this. There was one of these sex crime panics in Boise, Idaho. It was just a time of really heightened trying to understand what's going on, and the crimes that weren't happening were exaggerating, but they needed someone to blame. And the person they blamed, the people they blamed, were these shadowy, pedophile, behind the scenes, we don't understand who they are, homosexuals. They got it pegged. It was mostly heterosexual men doing these crimes, but homosexuals got pegged. There's a lot of these stories too. Oh, I have a book. Oh, it's up there too. I have a book that I wrote there's a lot of things that I cannot cover today. I linked in the notes some long videos I did that cover some of the topics in this book. I won't be able to cover politics at all today, or this period of the 1950s of McCarthyism and how that impacted the conversation about homosexuality. But there's a lot of history in this book too. The next book is different, but there's a lot of history in this book. So we are in the 1930s now. And how are homosexuals seen? We still don't say the word gay. We're going to start using the word gay culturally, actually not until the 1970s. Homosexuals are seen as sick deviants, pedophiles, broken people, people with sick minds. So I want to go to a slide here. So here we are. It's the 1930s. Homosexuals are shadowy creatures that prey on children, that prey on young people. They're sick. They're broken. We haven't quite labeled it a mental illness yet, but heterosexuals are free to have sex and enjoy it, but non-procreative homosexuals, they are a problem. So the view of homosexuality in the 1930s is, again, sexual deviancy, out of controlled lust, pedophilia, a criminal behavior. So we know, Ed and I know from the work that we've done, although this is the Bible, the 1952 RSV, in 1946, there was a New Testament, just a New Testament copy of this, which was, it came out, but there was not the big splash that it was when this came out. So we know from going through the archive notes that the work done on the book of 1 Corinthians was actually done between 1935 and 1937. No further work was done on it. The final approval was signed off on 1941, published in 1946. So where we have to situate ourselves is the 1930s. What did the translation team imagine when they were translating and they saw this word homosexual, or arsenokoitai and malakoi? The first mistake they made was they combined it, but they looked at their culture and they said, what's the worst sin we can look at here that fits this definition? And to the translation team in the 1930s, that word was homosexual. So now we're going to go back to Ed again to tell, this is a great story to tell how we found out all this information. Ed.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, it was the spring of 2017, and I kept wrestling with questions that I had, so many questions. And for starters, I couldn't believe that the word homosexual didn't appear in any verse in the Bible until 1946. I mean, I went to seminary and I didn't know this. So I started to dig and dig and dig. And by digging, I discovered that it was the Revised Standard Version translation team that made that decision, and that they left 90 boxes of archived material at Yale University for people to access. None of this was available on the internet. And so I called to see what we could do. And so I signed up for a library pass, but we had to go there in person. So I called Kathy Baldock, told her what I found. And before I could finish my sentence, she said, I'm going with you. And so in September of 2017, we ventured to New Haven, Connecticut for 1 week at Yale University and dug. And I can remember on day one, at the end of day one, I felt overwhelmed. It was a mountain of information. So 90 boxes of archived material and about 1,500 to 2,000 pages per box. Plus we found 22 microfilm rolls that each had about 2,000 sheets of paper on them. So you do the math, a lot of documents. And we had to filter that. And we had a prayer team back home praying for us that we would find this needle in a haystack, but it was overwhelming. We had limited time and a lot of information. And how could we narrow it down to find what we were looking for, which was if we could be a fly on the wall when they made that decision, that fateful decision, which we found out was in the 1930s, what would we have heard? What would they have said? What would have been their justification for that? What were their thoughts of homosexuality? in the 1930s when they made this decision. So day one, overwhelmed. But on day two, as the time got close for the archive section of the library to close, I felt hopeful. I thought we were pretty close to finding the answer because we were honing in on the First Corinthians notes about this particular conversation. And our focal passage, 1 Corinthians 6:9. On day three, we went into the archives and being hopeful, finding more information. It was day two, at the end of day two, that we found out that there were 22 rolls of microfilm. And that's where we actually found the information. We were very excited to kind of get in there and see what we were going to find. But the beauty of it is we didn't find this information until day three. In those first 3 days, we got to know the translation team intimately. These were godly men. These 22 men who translated the RSV were incredible. They were ahead of their time. So remember, in the 1930s, when they're doing this translation and putting these notes together, we found letters, which really revealed a lot about the people that did the translation. But we found these letters, and one of the letters, Dr. Weigel, who was the head of the translation team and also the dean of the Yale Divinity School, he wrote a letter to some people and said, you need to have women represented on a committee that you have over there, because without their input, you're not getting every side of the story. And then another letter where he said, you really need to have Black people on your committee because you're not getting a full picture and representation if you don't have all types of representation on your committee. And then we found this letter where this little old lady wrote to Dr. Weigel, and she basically said, Dr. Weigel, I'm just a housewife. And that's how she saw herself in the 1930s. And she said, we have a problem in our community. We have a poll tax. And if you don't know what a poll tax is, it's where you had to pay $1 for a registration card to vote. And without that registration card, you couldn't vote. And without your dollar, you couldn't get the registration card. And she said, Dr. Weigel, that's not fair. That's not right, because we have poor people in our community who can't afford $1 for a registration card. In the 1930s, that was a lot. She said, if they have $1, they're going to feed their family. They're not going to pay for a voting registration card. So this needs to change. She said, could you please, as the dean of the Yale Divinity School, write to Congress and ask them to get rid of this poll tax because it's just not right. And Dr. Weigel wrote back to her, as he wrote back to everyone who wrote him. And he said, yes, ma'am, you are absolutely right. That is an injustice. I will write Congress and I will tell them my opinion. And today we don't have a poll tax. It's illegal. So we can see how things that they would view were they were ahead of their time in the 1930s on justice issues. So we really started to love these 22 men who translated the Bible. And I found myself taking copies of notes that Dr. Weigel did on sermons. And I said, I want to present this one day. This is good information. It has nothing to do with LGBT issues, but there was a lot of good information. Just really an amazing person, and the entire team, just really amazing people. And there are actually some books written about them and gives a little bit more insight on them, but we really enjoyed them. So it wasn't until the third day that we found what we were looking for. Remember, our question when we went to Yale was, why did this team make the historic decision to put the word homosexual into the Bible for the first time in history? And we found the answer in an exchange of letters between a 21-year-old seminary student and the head of the translation team, Dr. Weigel. So, Kathy, can you please show us a part of that letter?
I think I can. Let's see if I can. Here we go. Oops, no, don't. We want to go previous. Everybody close your eyes. Okay, here we go. So Ed and I were on different microfilm machines. And in the 3 days we were there was one other person. And this is my tip to people that do research. Not everything is on Google. Sometimes things are in microfilm. And it's old people like us that we know how to go and use those microfiche films. And this is what we were looking at. And I was on a machine and Ed was on a machine two desks away. And we just kept scrolling through 22 rolls of microfilm, 2,000 sheets a roll. And finally, I saw at the top of the page the word homosexual. We had not seen the word homosexual anywhere in the files at all. No explanation, nowhere in the files. And then I saw right underneath it, 1 Corinthians 6:9-10. So I stopped and I said, Ed, come over and sit with me. And we brought a documentarian with us, and he took out 2 cameras and started filming us. And for the next 35 minutes, Ed and I read these letters with lots of commentary. And that film exists, which we now know is a piece of history. Well, I guess we knew it at the time too, but we were just so glad that we were prepared for this. So we found this letter. We found 4 letters, actually, to the translation team, back to the original author, to the translation team, and back again. And I'm going to read a portion of this letter. The first part's not on here. The person writing the letter was a person named David. And we found out at the end of the letter, in the second letter, he was a 21-year-old seminary student. And he says, after much study in this matter, I've come to the conclusion that homosexual is not only an inadequate translation of these 2 words, he says he actually calls it ridiculous. He describes homosexuals, which he has known, who are sincere, honest, God-fearing, with the highest personal moral standards. And he said, surely these sincere Christian homosexuals are not the abusers that St. Paul speaks of in his letters. They are surely not the arsenokoitai. To render both malakoi and arsenokoitai as homosexual is, his word, ridiculous. If only the translators had stopped to consider. He said, I am intensely disappointed and concerned about this faulty and misleading translation. And, he says, this slip shows personal prejudice and a lack of information. That he says that lack of information has affected their scholarly, scientific, and academic approach to their task in such a way as to render this inaccurate translation. Now, mind you, this was written by a 21-year-old, but it was the only letter we found. We found a postcard asking why they had done this, but it was the only letter we found in these archives where somebody said, you made a mistake. This is amazing. And out of these 120,000 sheets of paper, this was the only exchange. He goes on to say, I write this letter, which is your screen here, after many months of serious thought and hard work, partly to point out that which to me is a serious weakness in translation, but more because of my deep concern for those who are wronged and slandered by incorrect usage of the word. Since Holy Scripture is sacred to Christians, I am more deeply concerned because well-meaning and sincere but misinformed and misguided people, those among the clergy not excluded, may use the Revised Standard Version of translation of 1 Corinthians 6:9-10 as a sacred weapon, not in fact for the purification of the church, but in fact for injustice against a defenseless minority, which includes the sincere, convicted, spiritually reborn Christian who has discovered himself to be of homosexual inclination from his time of memory. I write this letter with certain homosexual individuals in mind, Christians who would die for their faith, their church, and their Lord, who cannot alter their biological state of being. And then he gets a letter back from Weigel. And in this exchange, Weigel says, I think you're right. Essentially, he says, I think you're right. Not in those words, but 2-page letter. We made a mistake in this translation. I get what you're saying. We need to relook at this. We need to revisit this. How would, if we change this to those who participate in homosexual practices, would that be okay with you? Another letter goes back. And David says, no, because it's not people that participate in homosexual practices. It's those that participate in homosexual vices. Now, that was a term at the time that meant rape, those who participate in rape, those who rape another person, those in lust and excess impose themselves on another person. That is the meaning of arsenokoitai. So he says, that's what I would be okay with. So Weigel says to him, okay, I get it. I am going to take your letters and I am going to put them in our folder so that when we go to look at this verse again, we will look at it. So as we went through this, partway through the first page, I turned to Ed and I said, this guy is gay. There is no way a straight person in the 1950s could have understood this concept at this level spiritually. So this is all on tape. It was pretty wonderful, but we had been working from 10 to 10, taking very small breaks because we knew we had a limited time there. And Ed was so excited. He said he went up. Going to the restroom from this basement room was quite a chore through security areas. So Ed went upstairs, and when he was up there, there was a choir in the beautiful atrium of the Yale Library. Came back down, and he said, Kathy, take a break. Kathy, take a break. Come with me. No, I was already upset. And we went upstairs, and there was a beautiful Russian choir. And I didn't know the words they were singing at the time, but they were singing a dirge about fallen soldiers and we will come and rescue you. And I'm not a person that typically connects to music, but when I heard this music, I mean, Ed will tell you, I turned into a slobbering, blubbering, I just couldn't control myself. Snot, tears all over his beautiful shirt. And he was just holding me. And I said, here's what bothers me, Ed. Somebody understood. Somebody understood at the time that a mistake was made. It didn't have to happen. So Ed had different feelings about this. Ed, why don't you tell us how you felt when we found?
Yes. On the day that we found the letter, and I was just sitting on the edge of my seat because I couldn't wait to see Dr. Weigel's response, and because that was going to reveal to us what he was thinking. When we were reading the letter, I actually thought David was a time traveler because he knew so much about homosexuality in 1959. So he was really ahead of his time. But Dr. Weigel's humble response when challenged was breathtaking. I was incredibly excited. And the fact is that, yes, he made a change to the following publication, and it was thrilling. And we know the history of that. They changed it because of David's letter. They changed it to sexual perverts, meaning someone who's abusing sex comes back to the abusive nature of sex. And so we see that kind of return to there. But I see the humility of the team of Dr. Weigel, and it was exciting. But the following night, and at that time, Kathy was in tears because she was thinking of all the damage that wouldn't have been done had this letter been intercepted sooner. Because the translation team, 3 months prior to receiving that letter, signed a contract that they wouldn't make any changes on any publication coming until the next publication, which didn't come out until 1971, 12 years after. So this letter missed that cutoff by 3 months. And as a result, Kathy was thinking of all the damage that wouldn't have been done had it been caught in time, because we can see what happened in the 1960s as the other translations utilized this RSV to make their decision to include the word homosexual in their Bibles. But the following night, that the day after we found the letter, I went from excited to depressed. And I can remember going back to our Airbnb there in New Haven, Connecticut, and I had a little room next to what was kind of a porch area. And I just started weeping. And I felt haunted by all the lives who were lost because of this honest mistake. I went to bed depressed and crying that night, just thinking of all the damage that wouldn't have been done had this been caught in time, caught before the 1970s publications of the New International Version, the New American Standard Bible, and the Living Bible that gave power to the pulpit to speak against these gay people. So after the 1952 RSV was published, there were some major events that took place before the RSV team was able to revise their work. And Kathy is going to discuss some of these historic events.
So here I am again, catching us up in history. There's going to be a little overlap of time, but I want you to understand that although these letters were written in 1959, they just sort of sat there with no impact. And I'll explain, Ed touched on it, but I'll explain in greater detail why no one did anything about it. So I'm going to catch you up in the culture. About this time, there were some very high-profile arrests of homosexuals in England. Sir John Gielgud, who was probably the greatest Shakespearean actor of all time. Alan Turing, if you've seen The Imitation Game, great movie, watch The Imitation Game. And also a conservative member of the House of Lords. These men were arrested for soliciting men for sex. So what the British Parliament decided to do was to convene a group, and they eventually called the report, the Wolfenden Report, and they were going to investigate how is England applying their morality laws, and should, going forward, since 1885, they had the ability to arrest people engaging in same-sex behavior. And this was really the first time that they started using it, even since 1885. And that is a fascinating story, too. It will be in the book. So they convene and they say for several years, they have this conversation, because that's what parliamentary bodies do. They have conversations for several years. Should sodomy be decriminalized in England? That's their question. At the same time, Derek Sherwin Bailey takes a more theological approach to this. He gets together historians and doctors and psychologists and theologians, and he says, I'm curious as to why our culture, our Christian culture, just seems to target female prostitutes and male homosexuals with our morality laws. And he writes a book called, and it's the first book on homosexuality and religion. He publishes it in 1955, and it's called Homosexuality in the Western Tradition. That's really a fascinating book, too. At the same time, there is a group of students at the University of Cambridge. So all of this is going on. This is being publicly debated. Are homosexuals sick and broken, and should they be in jail? There's a group of students at the University of Cambridge that are homosexuals, and the pressure is just too much. And they are experiencing a high rate of suicides of young male students of a certain type. So one of the students' friends is one of the people that commits suicide. He's a Quaker. He's a member of the Young Friends Quaker at the Jesus Lane Meeting House in London, in Cambridge. And he goes to his favorite elder Quaker, who's also a professor at the University of Cambridge. Her name is Anna Bitter. She's a zoologist, and he says to her, why? We're Quakers. Isn't there something we can do about this? Quakers are compassionate people. Quakers think and ponder a long time. In researching this, I went and visited a friend's house, in a Quaker friend's house, not a friend's house, a Quaker house in Reno, and had conversations with them. And they were very, very helpful too about their philosophies about thinking about things. So she had every Sunday night, she invited the young Quakers into her kitchen to have discussions, and she saw how bothered they were that this was happening on their campus. So she decided to convene a group of 11 other adult Quakers, actually one of the young Quakers too, and they met together for 5 years, once a month on a Sunday, to discuss morality and sexual issues and how Quakers should be perceiving these issues. For 5 years they did this. They also covered the topic, not just homosexuality, but premarital sex. That was one of the topics they did. So after 5 years of convening, they came up with a publication in 1962. And I have an original copy of it. Dreadful artwork on the cover, horrible, but it's called Toward a Quaker View of Sex. And so it's a 84-page booklet where they discuss, we as Quakers, how do we compassionately deal with those who identify as homosexuals? The Wolfenden Report hadn't come out yet. America still hadn't dealt with this. All over the world, Western world, homosexuality was now considered a mental illness. And the Quakers decided to tackle this not as a legal question. They didn't care about that. The Parliament had that. not as a mental health question. They didn't care about that either. Other people had that. They cared about how do we as Christians compassionately deal with a group of people that we know exist and are in our midst. And their conclusion was that Christianity is concerned with relationship, with God and man and man and man. They didn't see homosexual relationships as inherently sinful or morally worse than heterosexual relationships. This is amazing for this time. And this is the first religious group that dealt with this issue. Sexual sin should be thought of as exploitation and a lack of concern for the other. This is that word arsenokoitai, in seeking to satisfy one's own personal sexual and emotional needs. They recognize that sexual sin can even happen in heterosexual relationships and marriages. What they are concerned with is exploitation. So their other conclusion about the mental health of homosexuals is, if they want to go see a psychologist, go for it. But the church is not the place to deal with this issue. That's a mental health issue. The church is a place to love you. What a radical idea. So this book makes its way to the United States in 1964 to Glide Memorial, which Glide Methodist Memorial at the time it was called. It was in the Castro district. No, it was in the Tenderloin. And so a lot of gay people were around there. And it's also a beautiful story. It's already written. It's a beautiful story. But what happened was this gay clergy within this church and within San Francisco decided, this is a real issue. How do we love better those gay and lesbian people within our community? So they convene in May of that year, in the summer of that year, 1964, 16 clergy and 13 gay and lesbian members of the community go to Mount Tamalpais, just north of the city, over the bridge, for 4 days of talking and listening to each other. And this is also the pamphlet, the booklet they produced from this is also in some LGBTQ archives. So I've gotten to read the exact exchange of these. So then the pastor of that church, John Mooney, that January introduced a 4-Sunday series of how do we as Christians love better the homosexuals. Now, can you imagine this? In 1965, these conversations were having. 1962, the Quakers were getting it. 1965, the Methodists who had not united, who are about to divide it again, were having these conversations. This was also the time of the start of, in San Francisco, before the Stonewall, the gay revolution was happening with the Compton cafeteria, riots, which totally changed the interaction between the police and the gay community in that city too. But this was one of those things. After I finished this section of the book, I had another really good cry. And I had to call my pastor and say, talk me off the cliff here. I am so devastated that it was possible to understand this stuff. And it got so off track again, parentheses, because of politics. But it was possible. It was possible to understand this in the 1960s. And it just got so distorted. Change was coming, and it came quickly. In 1973, the APA decided that homosexuality was no longer designated as a mental illness, and they depathologized it. So let's take a step back now. In the past, David's letter. This is what, and Ed alluded to it. He wrote this letter in 1959, and I had wondered, why did it take so long for this translation team to make this change? If the head of the translation team knew in 1959 that he made a mistake, why did it take until 1971 to change this? So the answer was found in a book. I was writing a story about Luther Weigel, the head of the team, and I wanted to go to the original source. I found it on a grandchild's blog, but I wanted to go to the original source because that's what you do. You don't want to cite, something other than the original source. So for 99 cents on eBay, I ordered this book, The Glory Days, and it's a collection of 99 cents and $3.99 to ship. That's the way it is. A collection of essays written by his son in 1976 after Luther Weigel had died. And so I was reading this story about how Luther Weigel met his wife. That was the story I was after. And I thought, heck, I've got this book. I might as well read the whole book. If you know me, I like to read. So I started reading, and there was a chapter in here written by the publisher of the RSV. And in this, he says, and I had never read this anywhere else, he says, the team got together for 9 days in January of 1959 to talk about 300 objections and criticisms that people had about the RSV. And they were going to resolve them. So they sat for 9 days and resolved those. And then they submitted those changes to the publisher on September 1st, and then came to an agreement on October 1st that no more translation changes would be made to the RSV in any of the various forms. By then, a Lutheran version came out, a Catholic version came out, a children's version came out. No more changes would be made for at least 10 years. So when we went further into so I didn't know this at the time, but as we went further into the archives, we could see the translation team getting together in 1964. They decided not to make a decision. 1968, no decision, deferment. 1969, it says right in the margin to look at 13 pages that are attached to this. And the 13 pages were David and the letters back and forth. Nobody else had objected to this. So when they went to make the translation change, the only documents they relied upon was this letter exchange from David 12 years before that. And so they decided not to use those who participate in homosexual practices or those who participate in homosexual vices. It was 1969. Things were changing. The Methodists had met, the Quakers had met, gay people were coming out of the closet, and the translation team decided this was not about homosexuals. This was about sexual perverts. So that's how they changed it. And so you may be wondering, next. Who is the person that wrote the letter? This is actually wonderful. So we contacted a friend of mine called Tina Wood, who is a magician at finding people, and we gave her pieces of information. David had written this letter from a P.O. box in Lennoxville, Ontario, Lennoxville, Quebec, in 1959. And so I forgot to say one thing again. The translation team came to this agreement on October 1st that they would make no more changes. David's letters were written on October 22nd, 1959. As Ed said, he missed the deadline by 3 weeks. So the letter sits in the file for another 12 years. So we are so curious. I am convinced that this guy is gay. So we turn over information to Tina, and 11 and a half months later, Tina finds him, which, let me tell you, is a miracle. Because David wrote this letter from a P.O. box under his first and middle name. He did not use his last name. How we found him is an absolute miracle. And here he is. So that's that. The one picture that you see as a young man is when he had just graduated from divinity school from McGill. The middle picture is when we brought him to the GCN, the QCF conference with us a few years ago. And here I am with him. And he went on to become a United Church of Canada minister for 37 years through 9 pastorates. And 23 of those years, he traveled with his cousin, Jimmy, who was actually his partner. And people just thought he was his cousin. So it's a fabulous story. And one of my most favorite possessions is David gifted me his RSV ordination Bible. And it's mine. It's mine, Ed. It's mine. So what is really interesting about this is time had passed, right? So 1971 when they made this translation work, The Methodists, as I said, had already started going around the country. They started this thing called the Council on Religion and Homosexuality. They were having these discussions. They were having discussions in cities and in churches to say, how do we best treat the homosexual? Homosexuality wouldn't be depathologized till 1973, but conversations were still happening. But when they changed this translation, finally in 1971 to sexual perverts, a lot had happened in the 32 years between 1935 and 37 when they made that mistake. Now, Ed's going to talk, he's going to catch us up with the theology again.
So there we have it. 1946, the word homosexuals appears in the Bible for the first time in the RSV version. Let's look and see what happened after that time. So in 1946, RSV kicks out homosexuals in their version. Then in 1971, the New American Standard Bible puts effeminate for malakoi and homosexuals for arsenokoitai. 1971, the Living Bible comes out and it combines the two, just like the RSV, keeps it the same as the RSV, the word homosexuals. 1978, the New International Version comes out. Malakoi, they make it into male prostitutes. Arsenokoitai turns into homosexual offenders. And I have friends who say, there it is in the Bible, homosexual offenders. So those of you who offend homosexuals, you're going to hell. But anyway, that's another way to look at it. And in 2001, the ESV, English Standard Version, comes out with men who practice homosexuality. And if you look at this verse, women are not mentioned, so this might be a lesbian loophole here. So let's go back to these. The versions on, all the versions on this page right here, RSV, NASB, TLB, NIV, ESV. Kathy and I have looked through the translation notes on all of these with the exception of the ESV because they would not talk to us. They wouldn't give us information. They said the translation notes are not available. But we have gone through the translation notes for all of these, and we can tell you from going through the translation notes, we have seen how they used the first one, the RSV, as their basis for including the word homosexual in their versions. So these 1970 versions, NASB, TLB, NIV, put the word homosexual in those verses and a couple of other verses. And then in the 1970s, we start to see from the pulpits where pastors are using these verses as a weapon. Pastor David predicted it. The Bible could be used as a sacred weapon to harm those who really want a relationship with Jesus. But because of biological differences, as he put it in 1959, the church could actually start to attack these people. And this is what happened. And since the 1970s, we've seen the largest amount of teen and young adult suicide in the history of the world. So the question we have to ask from here is, what should have been there? How should it have been translated? What should we see when we see 1 Corinthians 6:9? If we wanted to take all the information from the past 2,000 years and all the work that Kathy and I have done, how could we actually see a more accurate version here? Well, we have to take into account in 1973, the APA declared homosexuality is no longer a mental illness. It's a normal part of human sexuality. But that didn't reflect in these translations. Two of them had already been published. One was getting ready to be published, and the New Testament for the NIV had already been done by 1973. They did all of their work in the 1960s to publish these in the 1970s. So respecting both scientific and ancient meanings of words, a superior translation of 1 Corinthians 6:9 could have been, should have been, those who use and abuse sex and those who use and abuse others sexually. So actually, this is the way the Message translates it, which is actually a paraphrase, but it does a pretty good job of this. Eugene Peterson, who died a few months ago, is actually the one who translated the Bible that is what we call the Message Bible, the Message translation. And he is actually affirming, and his biography just came out last week, if you've been seeing in the news, and he was affirming of same-sex marriages, committed monogamous same-sex marriages. So if we look at that and we return the abusive nature of this word arsenokoitai and malakoi to this verse, and we become more accurate with the translation of what's actually going on here, then we might actually start to see things the way God has seen it all along. Remember, we've included this human portion of the New Testament, the Old Testament, the Bible, what we have today. So God is perfect, yes. Jesus doesn't change, yes. But our perspective has changed. Our translation, because we are human, we can make mistakes. Hence, we have 450 different English translations, paraphrases, and versions. Obviously, someone wanted to produce a new translation of the English Bible because they said the one that we currently have isn't quite there. So we need to either update the language or we want something more accurate. So all of those 450 translations in English don't agree with each other. Otherwise, they wouldn't have produced another copy. So where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Let's turn it back over to Kathy, and she's going to let us know.
Maybe. Kathy and slide. There we go. Next. Oh, I guess we'll go all the way to the end. Here we go. So this is a great project. So not only are Ed and I co-authoring a book, which will be out in November, called Forging a Sacred Weapon from David's Letter, How the Bible Became Anti-Gay. And we're not using LGBT on there because we want to know how it became anti-gay. It became anti-gay first before the other steps. There's also a documentary being made about this, released about the same time, 1946, the movie. I have a resource sheet that I submitted. All of these things are on it. One of the things I really want to encourage you to do, because it's one of the favorite experiences I've ever had at the Reformation Project conference 2 Octobers ago, was I got to interview publicly Reverend David. He came down from Canada. And it's one of the sweetest interviews I promise you will ever watch. You will smile and cry, and even if you're in your room, you're alone, you will stand up and applaud because you will love him. And so please watch that interview. And then I've also linked 5 hours of interview. If you didn't get enough of me today, you can have 5 hours with me on YouTube. So that's where we're going. And it's a really exciting project. And I want to come back to me and Ed. Here we are. So, Ed, thank you for being a great research partner. And thank you, Mike. Oh, yeah, we have to. Oh, it's this way. Oh, it's that way. And thank you, Mike, for managing to keep the both of us on a screen and sharing slides. And thank you, Trey, for inviting us. We're going to be doing a discussion in the social lounge for an hour afterwards. And thank you. Thanks, Ed.
And thank you for the ASL translators, too.
Oh, yeah. Yay! Thanks.